Welcome. I'm Bruce Munro. With me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman. And this is Global Insight. In 2011, it looked like the Arab Spring uprisings could bring sweeping democratic reforms throughout the Arab world. One of those countries was Egypt. The man who became president of Egypt after those demonstrations was Mohamed Morsi. But this week Morsi died in the custody of the military-backed government that pushed him out of power in 2013. Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
I want to ask you today about the legacy of the Arab Spring. But let's start by asking, what was the Arab Spring and what countries did it affect?
Well, the Arab Spring was something that came almost out of the blue for outside observers, and it consisted of protests, anti-government demonstrations, which seemed to be largely spontaneous, and also it led to, in some cases, armed resistance by members of the population. A number of countries were affected by the Arab Spring. The most directly affected were countries such as Tunisia, Egypt, Libya and the Yemen. All those countries saw governments overthrown in this process. Other countries were also deeply affected. The civil war in Syria is a direct result of the Arab Spring, or as it's sometimes called by Arab observers, the Arab Awakening.
The Arab Spring began with a Tunisian vegetable seller's desperate protest. Almost a decade later, what's the legacy of the Arab Spring in Tunisia?
Well, Tunisia is seen by some as the model for democratic transition that was ushered in by the Arab Spring. But it's got to be said that it remains a fragile situation in Tunisia. There is more freedom than there was, but a couple of qualifications to that. Firstly, although the elected government that succeeded the dictatorship of Ben Ali, which was overthrown because of the Arab Spring, has survived, elections in 2014 brought a number of figures from the old Ben Ali dictatorship back into politics. In fact, two ministers in the current government hold the same positions that they did under the Ben Ali dictatorship. In addition, in 2013, a Truth and Dignity Commission was set up to try to open up the past and serve as a sort of institutional source of reconciliation in the society. Many Tunisians have been disappointed by the results, and one of the concerns is that with some of the old guard back in power in the government, there have been efforts to block genuine efforts at exposing the past. There was a lot of abuses during the Ben Ali dictatorship, and there are a lot of people implicated, some of whom do not want that fully revealed to the public. So I think there's been progress, but it's fair to say not unqualified progress. And unfortunately, according to non-government organisations, some of the practices of the old regime, the Ben Ali dictatorship, such as torture and detention outside the framework of the law, so to speak, many of those practices seem to have continued. So in a sense, it's progress, more freedom, but I don't think it's quite met the hopes of those who were behind the overthrow of President Ben Ali.
And what about the situation in Egypt? Morsi was the first elected leader of that country. He certainly didn't bring secular democracy to Egypt. Were we expecting too much too quickly?
Possibly. It's got to be said that Egypt, in comparison with Tunisia, has made much less progress. There were great hopes after the protests, the mass protests, which led to Hosni Mubarak's dictatorship being overthrown. And as you indicated in your remarks, it led to the first democratically elected president in Egypt, Mohamed Morsi, a senior figure from the Muslim Brotherhood, which was an underground political movement for more than 6 decades in Egypt, which, following the overthrow of Mubarak, was really the major source of political organisation in that country. But it's fair to say that President Morsi struggled somewhat in power, and that led to protests against his regime. And it was in July 2013 during protests in Tahrir Square, which was the sort of crucible of popular protest against the Mubarak regime. Morsi government found itself on the receiving end of protests, and it was the defence minister, General El-Sisi, who seized power on behalf of the military. And in 2014, in an election, Sisi became the new leader of Egypt, and we have seen a real clampdown. This is repression has come back with abundance in Egypt. And El-Sisi has classified, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organisation and tried to press, General El-Sisi tried to press his close ally, Donald Trump, in the White House to classify the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organisation. Interestingly, the Pentagon and the State Department declined to classify the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organisation, which suggests that General El-Sisi, who held a referendum which will continue his rule until 2030, and that referendum, by the way, was not seen as fair and free, has basically put himself in power for a long time and is very intolerant of any opposition. So that to some extent, many Egyptians feel the country has regressed. And some describe it as a worse situation now than it was under Mubarak. But whether it's difficult to be precise on that issue, though.
What do the contrasting experiences of Tunisia and Egypt show us about the legacy of the Arab Spring? Was it a new beginning or was it a false dawn?
I think it was a bit of both. I think it'd be easy to conclude, given the experience of countries like Egypt and also Libya and Yemen, where dictatorships in various stripes and form remain, or authoritarian power remains, that it's been a failure. But I think that would be premature. And the reason I think it's premature for three reasons, because I think there were three drivers behind the Arab Spring, and I think those drivers for change remain in place. One driver was the demographic explosion that's occurred in the Arab world. The population has rapidly increased with all the demands that imposes on society, and about 30% of Arabs are under 30. So you've got a predominantly young population with access to new technology which allows instant and relatively discreet communication. The second point, I think, which is really important, is economic decline. The economic situation in the Arab world, in the Middle East, has got worse. Egypt is experiencing severe inflation at the moment, and Saudi Arabia, which has for a long time been a bit of an economic engine in the Middle East for the Arab world because of the fact that it was the biggest producer of oil, but oil prices have slipped in recent years. And so, in a sense, the economic outlook is not good, and it also means that for many young Egyptians, or not just Egyptians, but people in the Middle East, the prospects of employment are not good. As much as 30% of the populations in many Arab countries remain unemployed. The third factor is that repression remains widespread in the Middle Eastern world. So you have this tension between a population which have access to mobile telephones and new technology which facilitates communication, and the day-to-day repression, the arbitrary arrest of people who protest, for example. So I think, on balance, those three drivers continue to be in place. And I think if we look at past history by analogy, just because the immediate changes unleashed by the Arab Spring did not immediately work out as hoped by the protesters that supported those changes, that doesn't mean they're not going to have long-lasting effects. In short, I think those drivers of economic decline, demographic increases, and also repression are going to combine for further upheavals. If we look at two countries which are currently experiencing protests, Algeria and Sudan, and many of those people who are protesting have been inspired by the memories of what occurred in 2010, 2011, which saw the overthrow of dictators, dictatorships which had previously been seen as untouchable. And I think that people power is not over in the Middle East. and so we could see further convulsions in the future.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Filama.